customers, employees, investors, actually they really need to understand the story of where you come from and where you're going. And impact measurement is part of that. And I think you do often find founders who maybe that wasn't what they did before. They may well come from a sector or a place where that idea of storytelling and building the story of the business wasn't important. So that's a learned skill that we see people, having to develop.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Vinay. I lead investor partnerships for EMEA at Tracxn. Welcome to another podcast of the VCs, the sourcing stack. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Paul from Bethnal Green Ventures, which is widely recognized as Europe's leading early stage tech for good venture capital firm. Since launching in 2012, the firm has backed over 200 startups tracking major social and environmental challenges through technology. Paul co-founded BGV and has spent more than a decade helping shape the tech for good ecosystem in Europe. Prior to this, he founded an education technology startup and worked in policy and innovation roles focused on technology and social impact. In 2020, he was awarded an OBE for services to startup investment. Paul, it's great to have you with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Great. Looking at Bethnal's, the rise of tech for good, right? Bethnal Green Ventures started investing in tech for good more than a decade ago. What originally convinced you that venture-backed startups could tackle social and environmental challenges?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it was a very different time from now when I think back. And I think there were two trends that I noticed that at the time that really convinced me there was an opportunity here. One was actually that we were in my spare time and with some other friends, we were organizing hack weekends in the building where our office was. And we would bring together people for those weekends who understood particular like social or environmental problems with our friends who were developers, engineers, designers, marketeers, whatever it was. And we just see if they could build something. That was the aim of the weekend. They were called social innovation camps. And what really struck us was just how talented the people were who were coming along. It was the real A-list of developers or engineers, because they really cared about these problems and they were willing to spend their whole weekend working on it. So that was the first thing I saw. There was this community of people who really wanted to put their skills to work. And then the other thing was it was just starting to see the beginnings of impact investment in Europe. And the government in the UK had just announced that they were going to do something with what are called dormant bank accounts. So basically bank accounts that people have forgotten about. And there's lots of money sitting in those bank accounts. And you can go and claim it back if you remember, but actually it just sits doing nothing. And the government had decided, okay, well, why don't we actually put that to work to have a positive impact? And you're just starting to see firms also identifying that opportunity for impact investing. So really, the Bethnal Green Ventures came because we saw this at the intersection of there's these amazing founders coming up who want to put their skills to work. And there might be, although that was a bit of a bet, this pool of capital that we could put to work to help them. And that was the origin story, really, of Bethnal Green Ventures, was that we wanted to sit in the middle of the founders and the capital who all wanted to have a positive impact using technology.
Right. That early conviction clearly came well before impact investing became mainstream. Now, when you launched BGV in 2012, impact investing in technology was still relatively niche. How has the ecosystem evolved since then?
So it's certainly 10x'd. I think it might even have 10x'd twice in that time. When you look at the the amount of capital globally that is going towards impact investing. I mean, despite some of the knockbacks from things like the anti-ESG rhetoric and all those kinds of things, actually the money that is going to not just sort of lower environmental social risk, but is going to having a positive impact, continues to grow as far as I can see every year. So it feels very different. There's also a level of maturity of the ecosystem, I think, that's there now that wasn't when we started. So things like, there's lots of people who can help you with impact measurement or with governance, or all of the providers, the suppliers, the events, the networks, all of those things have matured as well in a way that probably didn't even think about back when we started. But it feels like Tech for Good and impact investing more broadly is a much more mature ecosystem now than it was back in 2012.
Right. And today we see many investors talking about impact.
Yeah, absolutely. They maybe don't all talk about it in quite the same way, but we can come on to that.
What distinguishes genuine tech for good investing from impact as a narrative?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question right now, because as I say, that the ecosystem has matured, and it's also grown, and there's more debate basically now about what constitutes like real impact and so on. And I think that's a very good thing. For us, the definition of impact and tech for good is that it's intentional. So like the founders and the people who are backing that company are doing it because they intentionally want to change something. It's not just that they're like they've decided that this is the next big thing and so they're going to jump onto that. It's like they intentionally want to change something. And the second piece is that it's measurable. So that there is going to be a way of knowing whether that company has changed the thing that they set out to change. And I think if a company, if a venture has those two things, in that it's got an intentional, motivation and plan to try and change or improve a social or environmental issue, and it's going to do that in a measurable way, then that's a tech for good business. That's an impactful business, and that's what we're looking for. Not everybody who calls themselves an impact investor would necessarily do those two things, but that for us, that's what it means.
Excellent. Let's talk about how philosophy translates into the way you invest. So BGV Ventures focuses on founders tackling major social and environmental challenges. How do you identify problems that are both meaningful from an impact perspective and viable venture opportunities?
Well, absolutely. So we choose three broad outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So one is a sustainable planet, healthy lives, and an inclusive society. That's how we describe it. To be honest, those are quite general. I no bones about it. But what we find is that they're specific enough that then founders come to us having identified a really important problem in one of those areas. And it tends to be that they've got some either direct personal experience of that problem, so lived experience, as it's sometimes called. They might have professional experience of it, so they may well be working in that sector or around that problem and seen like what's going wrong, or they might actually have like sort of family experience of it. So obviously with health issues, that comes up quite often, that people have got family members who've been affected by a particular condition.
Right.
And what we really look for is founders who can teach us something about the problem. So obviously we know generally about like, the problems that face the healthcare sector. But if somebody can come to us and say, look, I've experienced this problem. Actually, this is bad. It really affects people, but there is a way to solve it. And if it's solved, then it will help this many people. Then that's for us much more compelling than us going out and saying, we're looking for people to solve problems to do with cancer, for example. So we're really driven by the founder's closeness to the problem and then being able to essentially teach us something about it.
Right. And with that in the lens, which areas are most interesting for you today? Climate technology, health, education, financial inclusion, or something else emerging?
Yeah. So we are quite broad investors. We like to have a broad range of companies in our portfolio, partly because we go super early and it is very risky. We are like most of the companies we back will fail. We know that. So we like to have a broad exposure to different industries and different problems. Having said that, I would say that, like, yeah, we definitely noticed an uptick in financial inclusion as an area. It's something where I think it seems like, maybe sort of fintech got so far and now it's bumping up against, okay, well, actually there's all these people who it's not serving. They need to think about new ways to address those
Right.
that population. And so yeah, there's definitely been a lot of innovation in the last couple of years around financial inclusion, which I think is very interesting. To be honest, it wasn't there even 5 years ago, and now it's definitely come up the agenda.
Great. But founders are still at center of every venture story. And of course, technology and markets matter. When evaluating founders in the tech for good space, what signals tell you they can build both impact and scalable company?
Yeah, I mean, so it's that passion about the problem is the first thing we look for. Have they got so interested in it, so sort of committed to it that they really understand it in detail, not just like that it's bad, but how it's bad, and like, what are the issues, what are the problems that lead to the problem, if you see what I mean. They've asked themselves why and how so many times that they really understand it deeply. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that they've got an idea of not just the product that they want to build, but the company they want to build. So they know about the culture that they want to create for employees and for customers and so on. That's always a really good sign of a founder who's building for scale from day one, I think. And finally, I think the best founders, they think really strategically about like simplification. So they think, okay, what's the simplest way to get to where we want to? And that often means that they've thought about how they can align the impact they want to have with the business model that they're building. So how they can make it so it's like the more of the product or service they sell, the more like positive impact they have. And that also, I think, is a really good sign of a founder who understands how hard it is, and basically like that simplicity, that strategic simplicity, is super important.
Great. That naturally brings us to the question of impact itself. One of the ongoing debates in venture is how to measure impact. How does BGV think about measuring real-world outcomes beyond financial returns?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. People always sort of have this idea that it's extremely complicated. Impact measurement is sort of, or it must be, you must need this huge framework and all these systems and all this kind of stuff. And our view is quite the opposite, is that actually impact measurement should be as simple as possible, and it should be as understandable as possible. So we don't really believe in what some people call fund level metrics, where when you set up a fund as a firm, you set particular metrics that you're trying to reach. We think that what that does is it means you try and fit the ventures to your metrics rather than fitting the metrics to the actual impact that the founders are trying to have. So our approach is to work with every founder, every team that comes in to us. We talk them through how to create a theory of change and like very simple, straightforward metrics that will show them whether they're achieving that theory of change over time. And that's it. Like it'll be really simple. It'll be so simple that you're like, is that it? And then for us, the important thing is that as then the company grows, as the venture grows, the standard of evidence that they're able to provide around achieving the theory of change gets better and better. So every time we reinvest, we want to see that they've got better evidence, better metrics around the impact that they're having. And that's it. It's so it's choosing a few simple metrics and then getting better and better at measuring them. And that's, for us, that's how you measure impact of tech for good ventures.
And I feel measuring impact is often easier said than done.
Yeah, I think it's not to say that you shouldn't sort of take on board what like practice and sort of understand it can get better over time because you got it wrong, and so you have to change. But again, I think sort of there's sometimes you see these big frameworks for impact measurement that are
Right.
actually meant for publicly listed companies, and you see startups trying to like pretend almost that they're able to do that, and it's just not. It's too much of a drag on your ability to grow. So actually, we're all in favor of very simple ways of doing things at the early stages that then grow with the company, rather than choosing a big framework to start off with and letting it slow you down.
So that brings us to a question. Do founders sometimes underestimate the challenges of proving impact alongside building a scalable business?
I think they do sometimes, yeah. But what the sometimes I think the lag is maybe that they underestimate the power of storytelling rather than necessarily around sort of impact measurement, if you like. And actually, customers, employees, investors, actually they really need to understand the story of where you come from and where you're going. And impact measurement is part of that. And I think you do often find founders who, maybe that wasn't what they did before. They may well come from a sector or a place where that idea of storytelling and building the story of the business wasn't important. So that's a learned skill that we see people, having to develop.
Right.
And I think that's something that we help with, but it is very important, particularly in tech for good and impact driven businesses, that you have founders or leaders, management teams of companies who are really good at being able to tell the story of why they're trying to solve this problem, why it's important, what it will mean when they actually are operating at scale, and how that will feel to their users, to their employees, to their investors, as well as being able to show that this is a really big financial opportunity. And it's a difficult skill, but I think that's the one that we see people underestimating rather than impact measurement per se.
Right. Looking across the companies you've backed, from your portfolio experience, what separates startups that successfully combine strong impact with strong commercial growth?
So I think the thing that holds people back is usually around sales or go to market, as it were. And I think it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between just a long sales cycle and a bit of apathy in that sector for the product that you're trying to grow. And that's an area that I think sometimes we also see founders who maybe start off by leading with the impact that they're trying to have when it comes to sales, but that's not the real problem for the buyer. There'll be another reason why the buyer wants to, and it takes them a while to identify that. And so I think that's the barrier that we see most often is particularly, and obviously it's more obvious in business to business or business to government sales, but I think it's also true in consumer sales as well. But is that it takes longer for them to work out how to sell and how to convert, because they've got this impact element of it, which sort of complicates that. And actually, the truth is that you really need to understand your customer, and that's the same with any business. But I think we do often see that the impact side of what people are doing can complicate that a little bit, and we need to help founders realize that the impact should be integral to the business, not necessarily like the front and center of the business.
Right. I understand. And scaling impact companies often comes with unique challenges. Now, what does scale look like for a tech for good company? Is success measured through impact, revenue growth, or a combination of both?
Yeah. So for us, it's absolutely both. We're looking for businesses that can do both. So we define our investment objectives as we're looking to back businesses that could be worth over £100 million and affect the lives of millions of people. And we're not interested in companies that don't do both. so if it's just a high growth company that's going to have a very high enterprise value, fine, but not for us. If it's a company that's just going to have like social impact at scale, also fine. Like, not both of those are fine, but they're not for BGV. For BGV, it's got to have both.
Got it. Now, are there particular barriers that impact-driven startups face when raising capital compared to traditional venture-backed companies?
Yeah. So again, although I said, the ecosystem has matured a huge amount, which it has, it's still, how do I put it? It's patchy. So it's stronger in some parts of the life cycle of a venture than others. And right. What I think happens is then you find impact ventures like working with much more mainstream investors for parts of that life cycle. And they may well like find that it's harder to find advisors in a particular part of the life cycle in the sector that they've chosen, for example. So we're not at full maturity yet, I would say. And that means that the interactions between sort of the mainstream and the impact sector are still a bit complicated. And that's right. One thing we've noticed. I think again, it's getting better and better, but that can lead to some issues, especially as companies are trying to raise more and more, and round sizes are going up. All those kinds of things mean that impact businesses can have a few extra complications compared to a conventional sort of tech product.
Excellent. Now, looking at your own portfolio, what patterns do you see in companies that successfully scale both commercially and socially?
I think they have a very simple story of like what it is they're trying to do, and why their product and their business is the right sort of the right group of people and the right piece of technology to do that. That tends to be one of the key pieces to it. And obviously, the founders who are able to like keep on learning, keep on changing, keep on like updating their way of seeing their customers, their staff, the people who've got that real growth mindset, I guess. So those are the two pieces. There's real simplicity to what it is that they're trying to achieve, and the founders or the leadership of that company have that real like growth mindset that they're willing to reinvent themselves, reinvent the business very regularly.
Great. I think this is a very great insight for the founders, how they can actually scale an impact-driven company, both commercially and socially. Thank you. Over the next decade, where do you believe technology can have the most transformative social or environmental impact?
It's really interesting times for this, I think. I think, I mean, if you look at health, for example, the amount of data and sort of that's out there now, like kind of is that we've been measuring digitally ourselves for certainly a high number of years across millions, billions of people now, and that leads to huge amounts of like interesting data, even if it is all anonymized, even just those sort of pattern data around that. I think there's huge opportunities in looking at that data, obviously in a safe and ethical way and so on, but trying to understand illness, trying to understand preventative measures, all those kinds of things. I think there's a huge opportunity around that. There are some limitations though as well. I mean, and I think people maybe, there's certainly people been talking about, oh, we're gonna solve all illness, using technology. I mean, the fundamental truth is we don't really understand the human body yet.
Right.
So there's all kinds of barriers to this as well. But I am super optimistic around the advances I think that will be made, particularly around preventative health over the next decade. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. When it comes to climate and sustainability, I think the most exciting background trend, which I think now like the technology world is adapting to, is essentially solar. So the rapid dropping of the cost of solar when you bring in batteries as well means that we're going to have a very different electricity and grid system in 10 years time from the one we have now, and software and like different ways of organizing the energy system include, and I would sort of tap onto the end of that, like agriculture and transport, and there's lots of other industries that are at the ends of that. I think again the next 10 years really interesting from that perspective. And then also when we look at just the needs of the population when it comes to things like education, going to change drastically over the next 10 years. There's lots of information out there, or lots of theories anywhere around what jobs are going to be important, what jobs aren't going to be important, but I couldn't tell you the truth to those. But I think what's not questionable is that there's going to be flux. And flux means that people are going to be dependent on education and learning. And so I do think that education and learning are going to be a huge sector, a huge industry, a huge like sort of source of innovation over the next 10 years.
Right. Are there any emerging technologies that could unlock new categories of tech for good startups?
Yeah. So until very recently, we had gone nowhere near things like biotech, for example. Actually, like we have started to now like look at some biotech investments, and that's partly because the technology has allowed those kinds of businesses to have a different capital requirement at different stages. So actually, you can do quite a lot with a small amount of capital now in a way that wasn't possible even a few years ago. So yeah, I think that there's some types of technology that are coming into the sphere of the kinds of work that we do, which are really interesting. I mean, to be honest, like even the sort of AI world was out of reach of like early stage investors until very recently. So yeah, those technologies moving into the space where ordinary people can start to explore working with them and then address them to the problems that they understand. That makes it a really interesting time to be investing.
Right. As you said, AI actually has been disrupting every industry like healthcare, education, energy, climate. So what's your perspective of this digital adoption of these traditional industries such as energy?
Yeah, it's definitely not as quick as some people are making out. I mean, there's a reason we have like heavily regulated industries. If you look at like, for example, the rail industry, or like food production, or whatever it means. Yeah, we have very good reasons to be resistant to change in those industries, because it's about people's safety. It's about like people's health and all those kinds of things. So, and that isn't changing because of AI. So still we have these very cautious industries where you have to be able to show that what you're doing is going to be positive and is going to be safe. And I don't see that changing, and all of the boosterism around AI just sort of sweeping away all of that, I just don't believe really. I think that startups still perform this incredibly important role of basically sort of seeping innovation into big organizations.
Right.
And you, as a founder, you've still got to know how to do that. It doesn't matter how fancy your technology is. You've still got to have that ability to understand those systems, those customers, and that's not going to go away as an important skill for founders in the AI era. It's there's a reason why we have slow moving sectors, and I don't think that reason is going to go away.
Great. Now, to wrap up things, if a founder today wants to build a company that genuinely improves millions of lives, what advice would you give them early in their journey?
So do as much as you possibly can to understand the problem you're trying to solve, and talk to people who face that problem, people who try to serve in in that problem area. So whether that's people whose job it is to work to try and help people in that situation, or or regulators, or just try and understand it from as many different angles as possible before building anything. I think you need to really understand the problem before building anything, and then when you do start to build something, build it because you've spotted where somebody would be willing to share value for that, so pay for it basically, because it solves a problem for them as well as solving the actual social and environmental problem as well. So it's all about talking to people. It's all about listening before you really push forward on the venture side of things, and that's so important.
Right. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective on how technology and venture capital can work together to tackle some of the most pressing challenges facing society. It's been fascinating to hear about the evolution of the Tech for Good ecosystem over the past decade, and how Bethnal Green Ventures has helped support founders who are building companies that aim to improve millions of lives. Your insights on identifying meaningful problems, supporting mission-driven founders, and balancing commercial success with measurable impact are incredibly valuable for anyone building in this space. Thank you again for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to following the continued journey of Bethnal Green Ventures and the next generation of founders here backing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.